problem. Alfred Binet was working in France after the Franco-Prussian War. I don't know how much history I have to give here. France was used to crossing the Rhine and burning down all the castles. If you go to the Rhine in Germany, all the castles are destroyed. You have all these ruins. The new ones have been rebuilt in 1900 or so. People have said, oh, it's a shame to have all these castles burnt down, let's rebuild them. So the ruined castles, some of them are ruined, some of them have been rebuilt in 1900 or so. But the French were used to crossing the Rhine and destroying the castles. They did that under Louis XIV. They did that under Napoleon. And in 1870, the Prussians, one of the little nations that became United Germany, crossed the Rhine and defeated the French, and the French were really upset about it. And they said, what is it the Prussians are doing that we're not doing, that they could actually beat us, because we're used to beating them in war. And they said, well, one of the things the Prussians have been doing lately is they have public education. And that means that people can read and write. The soldiers can read and write. Who had public education in those days? The United States, because we had this theory that people ought to be educated and vote. What percent of Los Angeles voters voted in the last election in Los Angeles? 10%. What percent voted in the last congressional elections? About 35%. So all it takes about 16% of the electorate to win a seat in Congress. All you have to do is convince about 1/6 of the people you can get elected. But all it takes is about 6% of the people to get elected to the city council in Los Angeles, because only 10% of the people bother to read the newspaper and figure out what's going on in the world and vote. But the French were worried about this because they were beaten in wartime. People don't like being beaten in war. And they said, remember Battle of Leipzig, after the French were beaten by this alliance of nations, including Russia and Prussia and Saxony and some of these other German states. You know, Napoleon gave this order to the general saying, after the army crosses the bridge, I want you to blow up the bridge. And the general gave the order to the major, to the colonel, gave it to the major, gave it to the captain, gave it to the lieutenant, gave it to the sergeant, and the sergeant told the corporal, blow up the bridge. So they blew up the bridge while the army was crossing and while half of it was stranded on the wrong side of the river. So what was a defeat turned into a disaster. And what the Germans did in 1870 is they could have generals write out written orders for everybody. And the corporal could get an order that says, I want you to deliver 100 horses to this guy, to Lieutenant so-and-so, in this town, at this time, at this place, and this address, and the guy could read the orders and know what he was supposed to do. You didn't have the problem of verbal orders getting handed on from one person to the next. You could do everything with written orders, and people could read. So they said, we ought to have education too. So they had the idea of French public schools. What's a public school as opposed to a private school? Well, a public school is like this. You have one instructor and a whole lot of students at different levels. So some students, you're going too slow, so at the rate I'm going, it's too slow for some students. The rate I'm going is too fast for other students. Some people it's just right, but not everybody, so it's too fast or too slow. With one teacher, it's much more expensive. If you want to teach your son military history, you hire some general and he'll teach him, but you got to hire the general, it's expensive, right? It's only for the rich, only for the children of the Koch brothers and their families. This is cheaper, but everybody, if you're going to try to educate everybody, you have to have what's known as public schools. And the problem was, they were discovering something that you've already learned, which is that humans aren't very good at making predictions like who's going to succeed in school. Another case of clinical versus statistical prediction. They asked the teachers to predict who is going to succeed in the public schools. So they had this problem. Some students are falling behind in the schools. When you have one instructor and a lot of students, some kids fall behind. Which ones? You want to figure out which ones and do something for them. You have to make interventions. You have to try to figure out who is it that's at risk in that class. See, what can you do to try to help them along. Now, if you ask the doctors which students are going to succeed or fall behind, you know what they said? The stronger, bigger ones, the healthier ones are the good ones, and the sickly, thinner ones, those are the ones that are less attractive kids. The ones that are not as good looking, those are the ones that are going to fall behind. If you ask the teachers which are the ones that are going to fall behind, what did they say? Everybody knows it's the Protestants. Anybody stupid enough to be a Protestant in France, there'd been 9 religious wars. The Protestants lost all 9 of them. Anybody that's a Protestant is obviously a stupid fool. You know, if you're going to be a Protestant in France, and ever since the Bartholomew's Day massacre, they've been killing the Protestants and wiping them out and driving them out of the country, taking their property and making them go to other places. That's why they went to Canada and to what became the United States, the Huguenots. So the teachers were biased in looking at religion and ethnicity, or not necessarily ethnicity, but religion in this case. The doctors were biased. Binet's job was, can you predict success in school successfully? Can you find some tests that will be correct in predicting it? Now, what was Darwin's idea about how you predict? Well, Galton's idea, basically. The people that could stand the most shock would obviously be the ones. The people that could tell between 2 tones or 2 pins poking on their skin. The ones that could tell the difference between 2 weights. They had better nervous systems, so they would be the ones to be better in school. And the ones that had worse nervous systems, you know, they couldn't discriminate tones or weights, they would be the ones to fall behind. When they tried that, it didn't work. Instead, he found some tests that actually worked. And those tests, we're going to go through those tests, they become what's eventually going to be called the Stanford Binet when it's translated into American English, named after Binet, whose job was, can you predict who's going to succeed or fall behind in school scientifically and do better than clinical judgment at making that same prediction? So he tried to find a device for doing this statistically, and he succeeded. So we'll continue with that next time.